March 1945, rural Georgia. A convoy of military trucks rolled through the dusty roads of the American South, carrying 847 German women who had just crossed the Atlantic under guard. They were prisoners of war, members of the Wehrmacht auxiliary forces captured during the final collapse of the Third Reich, radio operators, nurses, administrative personnel, women who had served Hitler's war machine and now found themselves thousands of miles from home, in enemy territory. These women expected the worst. They had been taught that Americans were barbaric, ruthless. The propaganda ministry had filled their minds with stories of torture, humiliation, degradation. As the trucks approached the prisoner of war camp, many trembled. Some wept silently. Others stared ahead with hollow eyes, preparing themselves for whatever horrors awaited behind those barbed wire fences. Among them was Margaret, a 23-year-old radio operator from Dresden. She had not bathed properly in 3 months. Her uniform was stiff with dirt and sweat, her hair was matted, her skin covered in grime. The conditions during their capture and transport had been deplorable: cramped spaces, minimal food, no hygiene facilities. They had been treated like cargo, moved from one holding area to another, always uncertain of their destination. The trucks stopped. Armed American soldiers surrounded them, rifles ready. The women were ordered out. Margaret's heart pounded. This was it. The moment they had been dreading. Some of the younger women clutched each other's hands, seeking comfort in their final moments of solidarity. But something was different. The American soldiers' faces showed no hatred, no cruelty, just professional distance and something else Margaret couldn't quite identify. Was it pity? The women were led through the camp gates. They passed rows of barracks, clean and orderly. They saw other prisoners, men mostly, who looked surprisingly well fed, some even playing cards in the spring sunshine. This was not the hell they had imagined. This was not the brutal revenge they had been promised. Inside, Margaret and the other women were separated into groups. An American officer addressed them in broken German, his tone formal but not cruel. They would be processed, he explained. They would receive medical examinations. They would be assigned quarters. And then he said something that made Margaret doubt her own ears. They would be given an opportunity to bathe. The women exchanged confused glances. A bath. After months of filth, of degradation, of being treated as less than human, their captors were offering them a bath. It seemed impossible. It seemed like a trick. Perhaps this was the cruelty they had been expecting, disguised as kindness. Perhaps they would be led to those showers and something terrible would happen. But as they were escorted toward the bathing facilities, Margaret noticed something that shook her to her core. The American soldiers were building wooden structures, simple, crude but functional, bathtubs. They were actually constructing bathtubs for their prisoners. Steam rose from barrels of heated water. Bars of soap were stacked nearby. Clean towels waited on benches. Margaret felt something break inside her, not from fear, not from relief, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization that everything she had been told was a lie. The enemy was supposed to be monstrous, but these men were offering dignity to those who had fought against them. What kind of war was this? The wooden bathtubs stood in rows, crude but solid, filled with hot water that sent clouds of steam into the cool Georgia air. Margaret approached her slowly, as if walking toward something sacred. Her fingers touched the water's surface, warm, real, not a dream, not a hallucination born from exhaustion and fear. Around her, other women hesitated. Some refused to undress, convinced this was an elaborate humiliation. They had heard stories, whispered rumors of concentration camps, of gas chambers disguised as showers. How could they know this wasn't the same? How could they trust the very people they had been trained to hate? An American nurse appeared, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and patient hands. She spoke no German, but her gestures were universal. She pointed to the soap, to the clean clothes folded nearby, to the privacy screens being erected around each bathtub. She smiled, a genuine, uncomplicated smile that carried no malice, no mockery. Margaret was the first to step into the water. The moment her filthy body sank beneath the surface, she gasped. Not from cold, but from the sudden, shocking gentleness of it. The warmth enveloped her like an embrace. 3 months of accumulated dirt, sweat, and shame began to dissolve. She watched the water turn grey, then brown, as layers of suffering washed away. She began to cry, not from sadness, but from a confusion so profound it had no name. This was the enemy. These were the Americans who had bombed German cities, who had killed German soldiers, and yet here they were, heating water, providing soap, offering dignity to women who had served the Reich that had brought so much destruction to the world. Other women followed. One by one, they shed their filthy uniforms and stepped into the prepared baths. The sound of weeping spread through the bathing area, not the weeping of despair, but of something more complicated. Relief mixed with guilt, gratitude mixed with confusion. The psychological foundations of their understanding were crumbling. Anna, a 28-year-old nurse from Munich, sat in her bathtub staring at her own hands. Clean hands, human hands. She had not felt human in months. During the chaos of Germany's collapse, during the capture, during the transport across the Atlantic, she had felt like an animal, herded, numbered, stripped of identity. Now, in the hands of her enemies, she was being treated as a person again. The American soldiers maintained a respectful distance. They brought more hot water when needed, more soap, more towels. They did not stare. They did not mock. They performed their duties with a professionalism that bordered on compassion. Some of them were young, barely 20 years old. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Pennsylvania, who had crossed an ocean to fight a war and now found themselves caring for the defeated. Margaret scrubbed her hair, feeling the tangles loosen under her fingers. She thought of her mother in Dresden. Was she alive? The city had been firebombed just weeks before, tens of thousands dead, and here was Margareta, receiving kindness from the very nation that had dropped those bombs. The contradiction was unbearable. As the women emerged from their baths, wrapped in clean towels, wearing fresh clothes provided by their captors, a silence fell over them. It was the silence of cognitive dissonance, of beliefs confronting reality and finding no reconciliation. They had been prepared for cruelty. They had steeled themselves for revenge. But this simple act of human decency, this was more devastating than any brutality could have been, because it forced them to see their enemies as human. The transformation was not merely physical. As soap removed the grime, something deeper was being washed away. The propaganda, the certainty, the clear divisions between good and evil that war demands. Margaret stood wrapped in a clean towel, her wet hair dripping onto her shoulders, and felt disoriented in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. She had been a loyal servant of the Reich, not a fanatic, perhaps, but a believer. She had operated radios that coordinated troop movements, that transmitted orders, that helped sustain the German war effort. She had done her duty without question, convinced that Germany was fighting for survival against barbaric hordes who sought their destruction. But these Americans did not seem barbaric. They seemed ordinary, tired young men doing an unpleasant job with unexpected grace. The bathing facility became a space of quiet revelation. Women sat on benches, combing their clean hair, speaking in hushed voices. Some expressed gratitude. Others voiced suspicion. Surely this kindness had a purpose, a hidden cruelty waiting to reveal itself. A few simply stared into space, unable to process the contradiction between what they had been told and what they were experiencing. Lieutenant James Crawford supervised the operation from a distance, watching his men work. He was 32 years old, a schoolteacher from Vermont before the war. He had seen combat in France, had witnessed the liberation of concentration camps, had walked through the ashes of German cities reduced to rubble. He knew what the Nazi regime had done. He knew these women had served that regime, yet he also knew they were human beings, defeated, exhausted, afraid. And he had been raised to believe that how you treat the defeated says more about you than about them. One of his sergeants approached, a burly man from Texas named Martinez. "Sir, some of the boys are asking why we're going to all this trouble. These are Nazis, after all." Crawford watched a young German woman, barely 20, tentatively accepting a cup of hot coffee from one of his soldiers. They're prisoners of war, Sergeant, not animals. We treat them according to the Geneva Conventions and according to our own principles. That's what separates us from them." Martinez nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. But it feels strange, doesn't it? Being kind to people who were trying to kill us a few weeks ago. War is stranger, Sergeant. Peace is even stranger." Inside the bathing area, Margaret accepted a bowl of soup from an American corporal. The soup was simple, vegetables and broth, but it was hot and it was offered freely. She ate slowly, savoring each spoonful, feeling strength return to her body. Across from her, Anna sat with her head in her hands, overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. "How can they do this?" Anna whispered. "After everything. After the camps, after the war crimes, after everything we did." Margaret had no answer. She only knew that this simple act, providing hot water, soap, food, dignity, was more powerful than any weapon. It stripped away the dehumanization that makes war possible. It forced recognition of shared humanity in a moment when such recognition was most dangerous to certainty. The bath was not just cleansing, it was transformation. It was the first crack in the wall of ideology that had sustained them through years of war. And once that wall began to crack, it could never be fully rebuilt. Night fell over the Georgia camp. The women lay in their assigned barracks, clean for the first time in months, wearing fresh clothes, their stomachs no longer empty. They should have felt relief. Instead, many felt something far more complicated, guilt so profound it became physical pain. Margaret could not sleep. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the quiet sobbing of women around her. In the darkness, freed from the distractions of daylight, their thoughts turned homeward, to Germany, to the cities burning under Allied bombs, to families who might already be dead. She thought of her younger brother, Klaus, who had been conscripted at 16 and sent to the Eastern Front. No word from him in 8 months. She thought of her father, too old to fight, but not too old to die in the firebombing of Dresden. Her mother had been there too. Were they ash now? Were they among the tens of thousands whose bodies had never been identified, never been buried? And here she was, warm and fed and clean, cared for by the very people whose bombs had destroyed her city. The guilt was suffocating. How dare she accept this kindness? How dare she eat their food, use their soap, sleep in their beds while Germany lay in ruins? Every act of self-care felt like betrayal. Every moment of comfort was an indictment. Anna broke the silence. "My husband is in a Russian camp, if he's still alive." Her voice came from the darkness, raw with emotion. "The Russians don't give baths. They don't give warm soup. They give bullets and hard labor and slow death." Other voices joined in, tentative confessions in the night. "My son was killed at Normandy. He was 19. My sister was in Berlin when the Russians arrived. I heard what they do to women there. My parents, I don't even know if they survived the bombing of Hamburg." The litany of loss continued. Each woman carried her own weight of grief, her own burden of survivors' guilt, amplified by the unexpected mercy of their captors. They were alive when so many were dead. They were comfortable when millions suffered. They were being treated with humanity by people who had every right to hate them. Margaret sat up in her bunk. "Do you think they know?" she asked the darkness. "The Americans. Do they know what was done? What we were part of?" A long silence followed. Finally, an older woman named Hilda spoke. She had been a Wehrmacht administrator, responsible for logistics and supply chains. "They know," she said quietly. "They've seen the camps. They've walked through them. They've buried the bodies." "Then why?" Margaret's voice cracked. "Why are they kind to us?" No one had an answer. The question hung in the air, unanswerable and essential. Why would victors show mercy to the defeated? Why would liberators treat the servants of tyranny with dignity? It violated everything they understood about human nature, about revenge, about justice. Lieutenant Crawford made his rounds outside the barracks, ensuring the guards were alert and the perimeter secure. He heard the muffled sounds of crying from within. He had expected this. Kindness, he had learned, could be harder to bear than cruelty. Cruelty confirmed your beliefs. Kindness demanded you reconsider them. He thought of the concentration camps he had seen, the skeletal prisoners, the gas chambers, the industrial machinery of death. He thought of these German women who had served that system, however peripherally. and he chose mercy anyway, not because they deserved it, but because mercy was who he chose to be. Days became weeks. The routine of camp life established itself. Roll calls, work assignments, meals, recreation periods. The German women were put to work in the camp laundry, the kitchens, the administrative offices, light labor, nothing punishing. They were paid in camp scrip that could be used at the canteen for small luxuries, chocolate, cigarettes, writing paper. The transformation began subtly. Margaret noticed it first in the mirror, a face she recognized again. Clean skin, healthy color returning to her cheeks, eyes that no longer looked haunted. But the deeper transformation was invisible, occurring in the quiet spaces of her mind where certainties had once lived. She worked alongside an American soldier named Private Tommy Chen, a Chinese-American from San Francisco, assigned to manage the supply inventory. He taught her English words while she helped him organize supplies. He showed her photographs of his family, his parents who ran a grocery store, his younger sisters still in school. He spoke of wanting to return home, to finish his education, to live a normal life. He was supposed to be the enemy. He looked nothing like the blonde, brutal caricatures from propaganda posters. He was kind, funny, homesick. He was human in ways propaganda had insisted the enemy could not be. Anna found herself transformed through conversation with the camp chaplain, Father O'Brien, an Irish-American priest from Boston. He visited the barracks weekly, offering spiritual counsel to any who wanted it. Anna, raised Catholic, found herself drawn to these conversations despite her reservations. "Father, how can you minister to us?" she asked one afternoon. "We served evil. We were part of it." Father O'Brien was quiet for a moment, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "Did you personally commit atrocities?" "No, but did you know about the death camps while you served?" Anna hesitated. "There were rumors, whispers, but we didn't know the extent. Not until now." "Then you were complicit through ignorance," the priest said gently. "But ignorance, while not innocence, is not the same as deliberate evil. You can't undo what was done, but you can choose who you become from this moment forward." The words struck something deep within Anna. For the first time since her capture, she felt the possibility of redemption, not forgiveness. She had no right to ask for that. But perhaps, and eventually, the ability to live with herself. Other women experienced their own moments of transformation. Hilda, the logistics administrator, found herself working in the camp office alongside American clerks. She witnessed their efficiency, their casual equality with officers, the absence of fear that had permeated every German military office she had known. Authority here was respected but not worshipped. Orders were followed but could be questioned. One evening, a young American lieutenant asked her opinion on reorganizing the filing system. Asked her opinion. Not demanded compliance, not issued orders. Asked. As if her thoughts mattered. As if she were a person capable of useful ideas rather than simply a subordinate to be commanded. These small moments accumulated. Each act of ordinary human decency chipped away at the edifice of ideology. The propaganda had insisted Americans were degenerate, weak, barbaric. But these Americans were organized, principled, and remarkably humane. The contradiction could not be ignored. And in facing it, the women began to question everything else they had been told. The moral universe of the German prisoners was collapsing and rebuilding simultaneously. Everything they had believed about strength, about honor, about national greatness was being tested against the reality of their captivity, and reality was winning. Margaret sat in the camp yard one afternoon, watching American soldiers play baseball. The game made no sense to her. The rules seemed arbitrary, the objective unclear. But what struck her was the laughter. These men who had fought across Europe, who had witnessed unimaginable horrors, who had killed and seen their friends killed, were playing like children. They retained the capacity for joy. German soldiers, in her experience, had not played. They had marched. They had drilled. They had maintained discipline and order, and the rigid hierarchy that defined military life under the Reich. Laughter was weakness. Joy was frivolity. Strength meant hardness, meant the suppression of anything soft or human. But these American soldiers were not weak. They had won the war. They had defeated the Wehrmacht, had broken the Reich, had conquered the self-proclaimed master race, and they had done it while maintaining their humanity, their capacity for kindness, their ability to laugh at a silly game on a spring afternoon. The paradox was devastating. Everything Margaret had been taught about strength was wrong. The hard men of the SS, the brutal discipline of the Wehrmacht, the pitiless ideology of National Socialism, all of it had failed, not because it was weak, but because it was inhuman. And inhumanity, she was learning, was its own form of weakness. Anna confronted a different moral crisis. Working in the camp hospital, she assisted the American medics who treated both German prisoners and American personnel with equal care. She watched an American doctor spend an hour treating a German woman's infected wound with the same attention he would give his own countrymen. "Why do you care?" she asked him one day, unable to contain her confusion. "We lost. We're your enemies. Why not let us suffer?" The doctor, Captain Morrison from Ohio, looked at her with tired eyes. "Because I'm a doctor. My oath doesn't have exceptions for nationality or politics. I treat the sick. That's who I am." "But surely you hate us. After what was done—" "Hate is exhausting," Morrison interrupted gently. "I've seen too much death to waste energy on hating people who are already defeated. You're not my enemy anymore. You're just a patient who needs medical care." The simplicity of his morality was staggering. No grand ideology, no complex justification, just a clear principle followed consistently. This was a kind of strength the Reich had never taught, had never even recognized as strength. Lieutenant Crawford observed these transformations from his position of authority. He had not undertaken this approach to rehabilitation out of sentimentality. He had studied the reports from World War I, had read about the Treaty of Versailles and the humiliation that had helped spawn Nazism. He understood that how you treat the defeated shapes what they become next. Cruelty breeds resentment, which breeds revenge. But genuine human decency, not weakness disguised as kindness, but strong, principled humanity, could plant different seeds. It could create the possibility of genuine transformation. In staff meetings, some officers questioned his methods. "We're coddling them, sir. These women served Hitler." Crawford's response was always the same. "We're showing them what democracy looks like in practice, not through speeches, but through actions. We're demonstrating that strength and humanity are not opposites." Summer arrived in Georgia. The German prisoners had been in American custody for 4 months. The war in Europe had ended. Hitler was dead. The Reich had fallen. News filtered into the camp slowly. Reports of Germany's devastation, of cities reduced to rubble, of a population starving and traumatized. The women read these reports with numb horror, each one wondering about the fate of family members they could not contact. The International Red Cross facilitated limited correspondence. Margaret received her first letter from Germany in late June. Her mother had survived Dresden. Her father had not. Her brother Klaus was missing, presumed dead somewhere in Russia. The letter was brief, factual, almost emotionless, as if her mother had exhausted her capacity for feeling. Margareta sat with the letter in her hands for hours, unable to cry, unable to process the enormity of loss. An American soldier, Corporal Jackson, found her sitting alone in the yard. He said nothing, just sat beside her in silent companionship. After a long while, he spoke. "I lost my brother at Anzio, my best friend at the Bulge." He stared at the horizon. "War takes everything from everyone. There are no winners, really, just survivors." It was the first time an American had acknowledged shared grief, the first time someone had suggested that loss was loss, regardless of which flag you served. Margaret finally wept, not just for her father and brother, but for all of it. The waste, the destruction, the millions of lives shattered by ideologies and ambitions that now seemed incomprehensibly stupid. Anna received different news. Her husband had survived the Russian camps, but was gravely ill. He was in a British-administered hospital in occupied Germany. She was granted permission to write to him, and in her letter she tried to explain what had happened to her in this American camp, how kindness had unmade her certainty, how mercy had been more transformative than punishment could ever be. She wrote, "I have learned that we were wrong about everything, not just the obvious evils, but about the nature of strength itself. True strength, I now understand, includes the capacity for mercy. The Americans have shown me this not through words but through actions. They have treated us as human beings when they had every justification to treat us as less. The letter would never reach her husband. He died 3 weeks later, before British authorities could deliver it. But Anna continued writing, to herself, to the future, trying to document the internal revolution she was experiencing. As summer turned to autumn, preparations began for repatriation. The women would be returned to Germany, to a country that no longer existed in the form they had known. The Reich was gone. Germany was occupied, divided, devastated. They would return not as victors, or even as citizens of a defeated nation, but as something more complicated, people transformed by unexpected mercy, carrying lessons learned in the strangest of classrooms. Lieutenant Crawford called Margaret to his office one September morning. "You've been a model prisoner," he said. "You've learned English remarkably well. When you return to Germany, that skill will be valuable. The country will need people who can bridge cultures, who can help rebuild." "I don't know what I'm returning to," Margaret admitted. "Everything is gone." "Not everything," Crawford said gently. "You're still here. You've survived, and you've learned something important. That enemies can become human to each other. Remember that. Germany will need people who remember that."